The night was calm over the Atlantic. Engines droned steadily, passengers slept silently, and the ocean below stretched on without end. At 39,000 feet, Air Transat Flight 236 seemed unremarkable. Another routine crossing from Toronto to Lisbon, but inside its wings, fuel was vanishing. Thousands of kilograms of fuel were draining away into the night sky. Silent, invisible, and deadly. The pilots believed their instruments were lying. In truth, the aircraft was bleeding out, and before long, both engines would fall silent, and 306 lives would depend on flying a powerless giant like a glider. This is the tragic story of Air Transat Flight 236. The cabin lights were dimmed, curtains drawn. A steady vibration filled the fuselage, the kind that lulls even the most restless passenger into uneasy sleep. Outside, there was only blackness, the endless expanse of the Atlantic, stretching from horizon to horizon, indifferent and empty. It was August 24th, 2001. A summer night like any other. At 12:52 a.m. UTC, Air Transat Flight 236 lifted off from Toronto's Pearson International Airport bound for Lisbon. An Airbus A330-243, tail number CGITS, carried 293 passengers and 13 crew across one of the busiest transatlantic corridors in the world. For more than 4 hours, it was uneventful. Altitude steady at 39,000 feet. Fuel burn within expectations. A routine crossing, invisible on the radar of history. But calm skies can be deceiving. Beneath the surface of this quiet night, something unseen had already begun. At 400 hours, 38 minutes UTC, while passengers slept and flight attendants checked the aisles, a fracture inside the right engine's fuel line opened just wide enough to matter. At first, it was imperceptible, a leak feeding the cold Atlantic air. Drop by drop, kilogram by kilogram, the aircraft's lifeblood seeped away. No alarms blared, no urgent lights flashed. To the crew, all systems still looked stable. The hum of the engines masked the danger, and in that silence lay the contradiction. A machine appearing flawless while its endurance was already collapsing. Below, the ocean stretched 6 kilometers down, a void that allowed no margin for error. Above, 306 souls placed their trust in technology and training. To them, this was simply another overnight flight, perhaps a long nap before arrival in Portugal. They couldn't know that somewhere in the belly of the Airbus, the balance between survival and catastrophe had already tipped. This was no longer a routine crossing. It was the beginning of a fight against an invisible clock. At the controls sat Captain Robert Pichet, a man whose path to this cockpit was anything but ordinary. He was 48 years old, a veteran pilot who had spent much of his youth flying in the rugged wilderness of Quebec's Gaspé Peninsula. Bush flying demanded instincts most airline pilots never used, reading weather without instruments, coaxing overloaded planes onto short dirt strips, wrestling machines with little more than raw skill and nerve. But Pichet's life carried shadows too. In the early 1980s, he had been arrested in Georgia, convicted for carrying a cargo of marijuana, and served 18 months in prison. It was a stain that could have ended any aviation career. Yet he returned, rebuilt his reputation, and eventually earned the command seat of a wide-body Airbus. That duality, reckless past, disciplined present, made him a man accustomed to walking between risk and redemption. Beside him sat First Officer Dirk de Jager, just 28 years old, calm, methodical, and trained in a world of structured checklist and automated cockpits. He was everything Pichet was not. Young, by the book, with a career still untainted by detours, his precision complemented Pichet's instincts, grounding the pair in a balance of experience and discipline. Together, they formed an unlikely but effective team. One brought raw intuition forged in hardship, the other steady adherence to modern procedure. Their differences would soon become their greatest strength. Behind the cockpit door, the passengers were a cross-section of humanity. Families on holiday, business travelers, couples couples chasing the European summer. For them, the flight was a bridge to new memories. For the crew, it was simply another long-haul shift across familiar skies. But the tranquility was fragile. The Airbus was already bleeding fuel, though no one yet knew it. And when the first signs of trouble appeared, the response of these two men, shaped by past choices, training, and instinct, would determine whether 306 lives ended in the ocean or survived against impossible odds. Every disaster has a first domino. For Flight 236, it fell long before takeoff. Weeks earlier, engineers had removed the Airbus's right engine after routine checks revealed tiny metal filings in its oil. That was a red flag. Microscopic shavings meant internal wear. The solution was simple enough. Swap the engine with a replacement. Keep the aircraft flying. But the replacement wasn't an exact match. It was a pre-mod engine designed with an older hydraulic pump configuration. Flight 236's airframe, however, was post-mod, built for the newer standard. On paper, the swap was possible, but only if extra steps were followed. Rolls-Royce had already issued a service bulletin warning mechanics. If a pre-mod engine is installed, several fuel and hydraulic tubes must also be replaced. Skip that step, and components could rub against each other during flight. That warning was ignored. The required parts weren't available, yet the engine went in anyway. Metal lines hydraulic against fuel sat too close, pressed together by the natural flexing of an aircraft in motion. Each vibration was like a file against the surface. Each hour in service shaved away material too thin to notice. By the time Flight 236 climbed into the night sky, the damage was already done. At 400 hours, 38 minutes UTC, cruising high over the Atlantic, the abrasion finally pierced the fuel line. A fracture, small but catastrophic, opened in silence. From that moment on, fuel gushed into the atmosphere at a staggering rate, 13 tons every hour. The leak was invisible from the cockpit. The wings held no external clues. For the crew, everything still looked normal. Yet the aircraft was bleeding faster than any engine could burn. A simple oversight on the ground, missing parts, a skipped bulletin was now deciding the fate of hundreds. The first hint of danger didn't look like a fuel leak at all. At 500 hours and 3 minutes UTC, Captain Pichet and First Officer de Jager noticed abnormal readings on the right engine. Oil temperature had dropped, while oil pressure spiked higher than expected. It was strange, but not yet alarming. Fuel coursing through the engine's heat exchanger was running colder than usual, chilling the oil system. The instruments were telling the truth, but not in the way the crew understood. For experienced pilots, engine anomalies were routine. More often than not, they meant faulty sensors or electrical quirks, and that was the conclusion they leaned toward. The Airbus's Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring System, ECAM, offered endless streams of data. In the noise of information, it was easy to interpret odd readings as false alarms rather than symptoms of a hidden bleed. The crew focused on the engine display page, trying to puzzle out the oil numbers, but by selecting it manually, they unknowingly suppressed ECAM's automatic display of the fuel page. It was a design quirk. Once one page was chosen, the system would not override it, even if something more urgent demanded attention. At 500 hours and 33 minutes UTC, a new advisory appeared: fuel imbalance. Normally, this would have popped up front and center, but because the engine page was active, it remained masked. Only when the crew deselected the display did the full picture appear. The Airbus had already lost 7 tons of fuel, an amount so massive it seemed impossible. To the pilots, the numbers felt absurd, more like an electronic failure than a physical reality. How could nearly a fifth of their load be gone? They didn't yet know it, but the clock was running out, and their next move, intended to correct the problem, would make everything worse. The numbers were staggering. The Airbus fuel gauges showed 7 tons missing, an entire truckload of jet fuel gone. For Pichet and de Jager, it was almost unthinkable. They had no training scenario that accounted for such a loss, and so their minds reached for the more familiar explanation: the system must be lying. This is the bias that investigators would later name confirmation bias. When faced with an improbable truth or a plausible error, the human brain often chooses the error. Determined to correct what they believed was an imbalance rather than a leak, the crew turned to memory. Instead of consulting the quick reference handbook, they executed a fuel balancing drill from recall. It was meant to be quick, efficient, second nature. The steps were simple: open the crossfeed valve, shut off the pumps to the right tank, and let the left side supply fuel to both engines. In normal circumstances, it was the correct move, but this was not normal. By opening the crossfeed, they unintentionally connected the healthy left tank to the fractured right one. So instead of solving the imbalance, they fed the leak directly. Fuel now streamed out at nearly 13 tons per hour, faster than either engine could consume. The Airbus was bleeding itself dry, and the very action meant to save fuel had accelerated its loss. Still, from the cockpit's perspective, there was no visible leak. The dark ocean below swallowed every drop before cabin crew could confirm anything. To the pilots, the readings remained unbelievable, but the consequence of their decision was absolute. The range of the aircraft was collapsing by the minute. The fix had turned the problem into a race against time, and time was running out. At 5:45 UTC, the crew made their decision. They declared a fuel emergency and diverted toward the nearest option, Lege's Air Base in the Azores, 1,200 kilometers from Lisbon and the only viable runway within reach. The cabin crew was asked to check for leaks, but it was still night. No light reflected off streaming fuel, no shimmering trail in the darkness. To the human eye, the Airbus looked flawless. Inside, its tanks were nearly empty. At 6:13 UTC, the first sign of finality arrived. The right engine flamed out. Fuel starvation, plain and simple. Suddenly, the Airbus was flying on just one power plant, a precarious situation for a wide body crossing the Atlantic. 10 minutes later, the situation collapsed. At 6:23 UTC, First Officer de Jager radioed a single word into the void of the North Atlantic sector: Mayday. It was the international call of last resort, signaling immediate danger to life, and then 3 minutes later, at 6:26 UTC, the left engine died. The cockpit went quiet. No thrust, no hydraulics, no electricity from the main generators. The transformation was instant. A 242-ton jetliner carrying 306 souls became a powerless glider, still 65 nautical miles from the Azores. Silence replaced the steady roar of turbofans. Only the rush of wind over metal remained. The crew now faced the unthinkable, guiding an aircraft built to cruise oceans, not glide them, through the darkness toward a single strip of land. There would be no second chances. The silence was startling. For more than 6 hours, the engines had been a constant presence, a steady roar in the background. Now there was only wind, rushing past metal skin at nearly 500 miles per hour. The Airbus A330 weighed 242 tons at takeoff. Without thrust, it was nothing more than a glider, an enormous one, but a glider nonetheless. Aerodynamically, the aircraft could travel roughly 15 nautical miles for every 1,000 meters of altitude lost. At 39,000 feet, that gave the crew about 130 miles of glide range. But much of that altitude was already gone, and Lajes Air Base lay 65 miles ahead. The dual flameout stripped away more than thrust. Without engines, hydraulic pumps failed, robbing the aircraft of power for spoilers, flaps, and brakes. Only a few systems remained on emergency backups. The auxiliary power unit tried to compensate, but with fuel nearly gone, even that was tenuous. Cabin pressurization collapsed, dropping oxygen masks for passengers. In the dark, screams and prayers filled the aisles. In the cockpit, Captain Pichet drew on instincts most airline pilots never used. Years of bush flying had taught him energy management, the art of trading altitude for distance, speed for control. Now those lessons were all he had. To shed excess height and align with Lajes, he guided the Airbus into a wide 360-degree turn. Then a series of gentle S-turns bled off both speed and altitude. Each maneuver had to be exact. Descend too quickly and they'd fall short of land. Hold too much energy and they'd overshoot reshoot the runway. DeJager managed radios, declaring the emergency and preparing for the landing checklist, though many items no longer applied. With no thrust, it would be a straight-in glide, high speed, and a single attempt. The passengers had no sense of the technical ballet unfolding up front. They only knew the engines had died, and the aircraft was descending in silence toward a speck of land in the vast Atlantic. Every correction Piché made was narrowing the line between survival and disaster, and now the runway was in sight. The lights of Lajes Air Base appeared through the darkness, a narrow strip of concrete carved into an island surrounded by black water. For the 306 on board, it was the difference between hope and oblivion. But the approach was far from ideal. With no thrust, the Airbus came in too high and too fast. Flaps, which normally help slow and stabilize the descent, were unavailable. Piché had to improvise. He rolled the aircraft gently, side to side, to bleed off speed. Still, as they neared the runway threshold, the jet was hurtling forward at nearly 200 knots, well above normal landing speed. Touchdown was brutal. At 600 hours and 45 minutes UTC, the Airbus slammed onto runway 33, more than 300 meters past the threshold. It bounced once, then struck again nearly a kilometer down. The impact blew out multiple tires instantly. With no anti-skid system, the brakes locked. 8 wheels ground themselves flat, bursting until metal hubs scraped against the concrete. Sparks lit the darkness as the undercarriage tore into the runway. Inside, passengers were thrown against seatbelts. Overhead bins buckled. Screams filled the cabin. Yet the aircraft stayed upright. Sliding, grinding, shedding speed, it clawed to a stop after 7,600 feet. Just 700 feet shy of the runway's end. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of smoke and the smell of scorched rubber. Against all odds, the impossible had happened. A powerless, wide-body jet had landed intact. But the ordeal wasn't finished. The cabin filled with smoke. Emergency slides deployed, passengers stumbled out into the night, some injured in the chaos of evacuation. 16 travelers and 2 crew suffered wounds, 2 serious but none fatal. A jetliner had glided more than 100 kilometers without power, carrying hundreds of lives, and landed on a narrow island runway in the middle of the Atlantic. It was survival at the very edge of possibility, and the world wanted to know, how had it come so close to ending in disaster? The landing was a miracle, but miracles demand explanation. Investigators from Portugal's Accident Authority, joined by Canadian and French specialists, began dissecting what had gone wrong. The root cause lay on the ground. Weeks before takeoff, mechanics had installed a pre-mod engine on a post-mod aircraft, ignoring a Rolls-Royce bulletin that required replacing several hydraulic and fuel tubes. The larger pump housing on the older engine pressed against a fuel line. Over hours of vibration, the metal lines abraded until one ruptured. That single oversight, lack of parts, pressure to keep the aircraft flying, had opened the wound, but the cockpit carried its own share of responsibility. Piché and DeJager confronted a mystery outside their training, an Airbus showing a 7-ton discrepancy. It seemed absurd, so they reached for a more comfortable explanation: instrument error. This was confirmation bias, the human tendency to trust what feels likely rather than what is true. Their next error compounded the problem. Relying on memory rather than procedure, they performed a fuel balancing maneuver that unintentionally connected the healthy tank to the leaking one. The checklist contained a warning: if a leak is suspected, do not open the crossfeed. But memory erased the caution, and the Airbus bled itself dry. The design of the aircraft also bore blame. The ECAM system issued a fuel imbalance alert, but never fuel leak. Worse, because the crew had the engine page selected, the more critical fuel page was delayed. The machine gave data, not diagnosis, forcing the pilots to guess under pressure. One by one, the failures stacked: a maintenance shortcut, a design gap, a cognitive bias, a skipped checklist. No single mistake would have doomed Flight 236. Together, they brought 306 people to the brink of catastrophe. It was a chain of errors, mundane in isolation, nearly fatal in combination. the world's aviation regulators took notice. Within 3 years, sweeping changes reshaped how wide-body jets were flown and maintained. Airbus rewrote its software. Computers would no longer shrug at massive fuel losses. Instead, they compared consumption against flight plans, issuing clear, unmistakable warnings when fuel vanished beyond tolerance. A fuel leak message replaced ambiguous imbalance alerts. The FAA and Europe's DGAC mandated new procedures. Pilots must confirm a leak is not present before opening the crossfeed valve. Airlines revised their manuals, embedding fuel leak drills into simulator training. Crews would now practice the exact scenario Piché and de Jager had never faced. On the maintenance side, service bulletins hardened into directives. Rolls-Royce emphasized incompatibility between pre- and post-mod engines. The culture shifted from expedience to compliance. Parts shortages could no longer justify incomplete work. These changes weren't abstract. They were written in the memory of Flight 236, the lessons etched in survival, not death. For Captain Robert Piché, the flight marked redemption. From a prison cell in Georgia to the left seat of a powerless Airbus, his life had been a story of second chances. That night, instincts born in Canada's wilderness fused with modern airmanship to save lives. For First Officer Dirk de Jager, it was the trial of a young pilot's career, calm precision at the edge of impossibility. And for 293 passengers, it was a reminder that safety in aviation is not a given, but the product of relentless scrutiny. Their survival ensured that millions of future travelers would fly under safer skies. Flight 236 ended with bent metal and broken tires, but no coffins. A bloodless survival, but a lesson written in fire. The Atlantic night was quiet again. The engines no longer roared, the passengers no longer screamed. Only the endless ocean remained, reflecting stars above. It had been a razor-thin margin, a fracture millimeters wide, a checklist skipped, a bias uncorrected. Each had nearly claimed 306 lives. Yet in the silence of that powerless glide, skill and instinct prevailed. History often remembers disasters by the lives lost. Flight 236 is remembered for the lives saved. What makes its story remarkable is not just the survival itself, but the chain of hidden flaws that nearly erased it. A fracture invisible to passengers, a system blind to leaks, a cockpit misled by human bias, all converged in silence over the Atlantic. And yet, through skill and chance, those flaws became lessons. Today, every transatlantic crossing carries the imprint of that night. Invisible but present. Safer manuals, smarter systems, and a reminder that aviation's progress is written in near misses. Flight 236 did not vanish into the Atlantic. It left behind a legacy, stronger procedures, sharper training, and machines that now warn with clarity. Out of near tragedy came progress, ensuring that countless flights after would never face the same fate. The story of Air Transat Flight 236 is more than an account of extraordinary airmanship. It is a testament to the fragility of safety and the resilience of those who defend it. In the stillness of that night, the line between disaster and survival was almost invisible, and yet survival won. If you found value in this story and want to see more investigations into the moments that shaped aviation history, consider subscribing to the channel. We post in-depth documentaries that bring context and clarity to aviation's most defining moments. And if this video helped you understand the events of Flight 236, a like or share goes a long way in supporting the work we do. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.